But the frightening thing to me is that the creation of a Big Brother society in Britain, the society which was most comprehensively warned against this by both George Orwell in 1984 and Aldous Huxley in Brave New World, is actually popular. That people like these things, that they say they feel comforted by the presence of CCTV cameras, that identity cards have a horrifying level of support in the opinion polls. And this is what frightens me. And the reason for it is that this is a frightened society. And people have reason to be frightened. The political parties largely ignore it in reality, but many, many people live at a constant but low level of fear from unpleasant neighbours, from criminals in their street, by people they see on their way home whom they're afraid of. And there is an enormous amount of this fear about, and there is a general decay of social obligation. There's a feeling that you daren't intervene in case somebody jumps on your head in any unpleasant crime you see in the streets. This is a very, very serious problem, and people see these things as an answer. I don't think they are the answer. I think the answer is the re-establishment of the free and ordered society we had until recently, before conscience was destroyed, before the married family, which is the basis of both private life and the creation of conscience and authority, was systematically undermined by the political parties who decided that it didn't matter anymore. And when before authority was removed from teachers and from parents and from adults in general over the young, and before that semi-visible web of protection which was everywhere, the patrolling policeman, the park keeper, the bus conductor, the ticket collector on the train, these people were withdrawn entirely. We're all very frightened because they're not there. The CCTV cameras and all the rest of it appeal to us as what appears to be a quick solution. They will just lead us to a Big Brother society. If you're really, really frightened, think seriously about trying to recreate the things which kept us free and safe not very long ago.
And for Peter Hitchens.
Thank you, Jeremy. It is a wonderful contrast, isn't it, that in the United States the case that I'm going to make is widely accepted, whereas here the chances are that afterwards the audience will beat me to death with rolled-up copies of The Guardian for trying to defend. No, they can't shoot me because they've been disarmed by the state. A couple of interesting points that people need to consider. Until the year 1920, as Stephen touched upon, the gun laws of this country made Texas look effeminate. There was complete freedom in this country to own and buy guns, to such an extent that the unarmed police, in one major incident in London when they had to deal with a foreign anarchist gang in 1909, borrowed guns from passers-by to shoot them. And now, what you will find if you examine the England of that period, the Edwardian period before 1914, is not that London was like Detroit or Dodge City, but that it was extremely peaceful and crime levels were very low. The issue of whether people are armed has very little to do with the level of violence. A lot of this argument is actually a snobbish gesture of contempt against the United States by English people who think they're superior, who point to American levels of violence and say this is caused by gun ownership. The reason why I rather reluctantly oppose gun control is because I've examined the arguments in favor of it, and they are quite straightforwardly an insult to the intelligence. What they fundamentally say is that we think guns are so bad that only criminals and terrorists should be allowed to have them. A law against guns will only apply to law-abiding people without criminal records. Most gun crime, almost all gun crime is committed by people who already have criminal records. Almost all gun crime is committed with illegally obtained guns. And therefore the idea that a law controlling guns will end gun crime is in itself ludicrous. I myself have absolutely no desire to own a weapon, but I'm very, very disturbed by the idea that my government thinks that I can't be trusted to do so and denies me the freedom to do so. It is a fundamental breach of the presumption of innocence. I am assumed to be of criminal intent and criminal mind, not to be responsible enough, not to be able to take decisions on my own account about such an important thing. Now, it does go back far beyond the 1689 Bill of Rights and Blackstone's commentaries, though they do confirm it. At one point in our history, citizens were actually required to have arms to help defend the law against lawbreakers. It is a perfectly reasonable thing for this freedom to exist. Those who oppose it fundamentally either haven't thought about it or they want the government to have, as Will correctly said, though wrongly saying it was categorical, they want the government to have the monopoly of violence. Why, if the government and the people are actually one thing, why, if the state is the people's state and belongs to us, if we are the democracy we claim to be, should the government want that monopoly? I leave that question with you.
Believe
Actually,
these things is to belong here.
This is what Saida Varsi was talking about.
Baroness
She
Varsi,
said
yeah.
that there are that Islamophobia is becoming the one acceptable form of prejudice, which is okay. And it's okay because people don't see the debates within Islam, don't see the discussions that are going on. I actually think we should celebrate differences, not tolerate them. Let's recognise it and get on with it.
Could I just challenge something which the Baroness said, which went unchallenged?
Okay, yes.
Use of the word Islamophobia.
Yes.
As if those of us who look at Islam and say we don't actually want this country to be an Islamic country and be governed by Islamic rules, are in some cases, in some way governed by an irrational fear. On the contrary, or a prejudice. On the contrary, it's a post-judice. We've looked at Islam. We don't like its precepts. We don't want them here because we prefer...
We don't want them here?
Prefer a Christian... We don't want the precepts of it. We don't want... No, hang on, wait a minute. Wait a minute. I said we don't want the precepts.
Precepts.
The precepts. I'm not going to be misquoted in that fashion.
Fair enough.
We do not want the precepts of Islam. That is absolutely clear. We got that clear now.
We got it clear.
Right. Nothing to do with not wanting Muslims here.
Fair
Any kind of twisted rubbish like that. I did not say that. I do not think it.
Peter, you've made that clear.
Right, OK. We do not want... No, we do get... People with conservative views do get their views twisted in broadcast arenas, and we do need to be clear when that happens.
Peter has made that absolutely clear.
It's one of our students.
Let him finish, Baroness. Let him finish.
When it happens... What I'm saying here is we do not want the precepts of Islam here because we do not want to live in an Islamic society.
Anyway,
that is a rational position. It is not a phobia and can't be classified as some kind of mental illness. It is a perfectly reasonable position to take. And people who want to take part in a civilized discussion should not classify the opinions of their opponents as phobias. They should take them on with reason, fact and logic, especially academics and professors.
Peter, thank you.
Well, joining me now are Steve Rolls, Senior Policy Analyst at Transform Drug Policy Foundation, and the journalist and author Peter Hitchens. Peter Hitchens first. Testing drugs at festivals, sensible idea, would save lives.
It would save more lives if the police and the courts enforced the law against possessing those drugs and people didn't take them in the first place.
You've got 11,000 people in prison at the moment for drug offences.
You have not got really more than a tiny few people, and they're exceptional, in prison for possession of drugs. Since the 1970s, this country has abandoned any kind of effort to interdict possession of drugs. It's made a certain amount of showy attempt to interdict the supply, but it's done nothing about possession. As a result, possession and use has increased exponentially. The lie which is told repeatedly by the legalisers...
Let me put that point directly to Steve Rolls. I'll come back to you.
Talk about prohibition.
No, I'll come back to you. I want to put that point directly. The problem is it's too lenient a drugs policy.
Well, I mean, enforcement approaches have been tried with different levels of intensity all around the world. And what there isn't is any clear link between the intensity of enforcement and the level of use. And that's not a conclusion that just Transform has come to. This is a conclusion that the Home Office came to in their own evidence-based review, and as has World Health Organization reviews and many others. It seems that as a form of deterrence, it's very ineffective user-level enforcement, but what it does do is it actually encourages risky behaviours and makes drugs more dangerous and drives people away from the kinds of health services that can actually help them reduce the risks that they're exposed to.
I mean, £1.6 billion a year is spent tackling drug use.
Can I just make a point there that what Mr. Rolls has just said is incorrect. In both Japan and South Korea, enforcement is effective. These are democratic, law-governed, free countries. They enforce their laws against drug possession. Drug abuse is much smaller. The Home Office,
but what about Portugal? What about Portugal? Let me ask you, because we're trying to have a conversation. What about Portugal, where decriminalisation... The Home Office report of which he speaks slid over Japan with a slightly racialist remark about how they had a different culture. We had a different culture in this country when we enforced our drug laws before about 1967. They have a different culture because they enforce theirs. Portugal is hugely overstated. Well, let me just explain about Portugal for people watching. Okay. Decriminalisation there
has happened, and now drug-related deaths are what? Death rate is 3 per million citizens versus 45 per million citizens in Britain here. That suggests it worked.
There are several problems with Portugal. First of all, what they did in 2001 was codify what was already happening. Secondly, there's no reliable statistics of drug use before they changed the law. Thirdly, a number of things have happened. Lifetime use of drugs has increased, petty crime theft has increased, murder increased immediately afterwards, and the number of people who die as a result of drugs is not by any means the only problem. The main threat from drugs in particularly the Western world now, it comes from marijuana, which is closely correlated with irreversible mental illness.
Come back to marijuana.
It's not death, but
if you could just take on what he said about Portugal and decriminalisation.
Well, I mean, Portugal has been, I think, by most objective reviews, a remarkable success. There hasn't been an explosion in use, problematic use, particularly injecting drug use, which is obviously the most risky type of drug use, has gone down. School-age drug use has gone down. So two key vulnerable groups, we've actually seen a reduction in use. There's been a reduction in the prison population, reduction in HIV transmissions, and a dramatic drop in drug deaths. And that's why it now has cross-party support, it has popular support, and their position has been broadly adopted and is now advocated by the World Health Organization, across the UN, and many others.
But you'll notice he hasn't addressed any of the points that I made. That the law was already extremely weak in Portugal. Actually, Portugal came late to the drug festival and doesn't have very high use of drugs compared with many Western European countries. There is no real evidence that it's benefited the country, and quite a lot that it's done considerable harm.
So let me put your point about marijuana to you now. Marijuana, particular strains of marijuana.
Let's call it cannabis.
OK, cannabis, skunk, cause mental health problems, potentially.
Well, I mean, I don't want to get into a debate around the extent of risk, but let's just say all drug use is risky and cannabis is no exception. So, but however risky...
So then why shouldn't the state want to curb its use?
Well, the state is perfectly free to want to curb use of any drug. The question is prohibition an effective way to do that, and does it reduce overall harm? Now, however risky a drug is, it's more risky when you hand control of it over to unregulated gangsters and street dealers. And cannabis is a good example where it has become more potent and more dangerous under prohibition.
That is a fallacy. When the campaign for cannabis legalisation at the moment, in the Proposition 64 in California, calls for advertising of cannabis.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Well, maybe you don't, but the big billionaire money which is behind this, the particular lobby, does agree with it and put it in Proposition 64 for a reason. If you look at cigarettes, for instance, a drug which is regulated as you wish cannabis to be, which is advertised and sold widely,
and used as halved in the last couple of decades.
It does, because you know what I'm going to say. It does enormously more damage than any illegal drug because it's able to advertise. It has access to high street shops. It has access to advertising.
Not anymore. And use is going down.
It will have if Proposition 64 is implemented.
Well, I don't agree with that. There are different.
I don't agree with it, but the billionaire campaign...
Well, there are different types of regulation.
Which is working for this,
does agree with it.
There are different types of regulation, Peter, and I don't agree with every type of legal regulation. I think we need to learn the lessons from alcohol and tobacco and make sure that when cannabis is legalised and regulated and where that's happening, that we do it properly. If you look at somewhere like Uruguay, they don't allow advertising, and that's one that we specifically worked on.
But let's come back to the point about testing.
Advertising is done at the rock festivals and by rock stars anyway.
OK, you've come back to rock festivals. Let's come back to testing, because that would save lives. Therefore, that would surely be a good thing, wouldn't it?
Only if it weren't a deliberate campaign to undermine the idea that the law should be obeyed.
It's just decriminalisation by the back door.
Absolutely, what this does is it gives the impression that the law isn't being enforced and doesn't matter. People who've purchased an illegal drug, which it is illegal to possess, then take it into other people who, with no intervention from the totally absent police force, then test this illegal poison to discover how poisonous it is.
This is a
mockery.
This isn't a monologue, it's a discussion.
The police have to balance their responsibility to enforce the law with their responsibility of care for the people they are looking after in the context of an event. The police are amongst the most enthusiastic advocates of these sorts of facilities, along with the local public health authorities and along with the event organisers, because they know that they work. And we've seen where these facilities have been introduced, the number of deaths and the number of critical emergency cases drops dramatically.
I'm afraid you're going to have to take this argument outside. Mr. Hitchens, you're going to have to take this argument outside. Hello, I'm trying to speak to you, Peter Hitchens.
I know you are.
Steve,
I'm trying to speak to your,
thank you very much for joining us.